of the Conversing Labs podcast. My name is Paul Roberts, and I am the Director of Editorial and Content here at Reversing Labs, host of the Conversing Labs podcast, where we dig into the latest developments in areas like malware and threat analysis, software supply chain risks, cybersecurity in general. I'm thrilled this week to have with us in the studio Mr. Casey Ellis. Casey is the co-founder of Bugcrowd and one of the leading advocates of bug bounty platforms. He's also the co-founder of Disclose.io, a project to standardize vulnerability disclosure, and a leading advocate globally for greater software transparency and security. We're thrilled to have him on the show. Casey, welcome.
Thank you for the glowing intro, Paul. Good to be here.
It's the best I could do, man. It's great to have you, man. First of all, welcome. I don't think we've had you on the show before.
No, I don't believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
So that's gonna put on you the requirement to give us a little bit of your origin story and how you found your way to cybersecurity and vulnerability hunting and stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, short version of it is I grew up, hacking stuff as a kid. Got introduced to technology at a pretty young age and immediately started to break it. I think it was the combination of like curiosity and the fact that I like enjoy thinking like a criminal but don't want to be one. So that was sort of high school, and then pretty much coming out of high school, I like tripped over into a pen testing job. So that was sort of the beginning of my information security career. That was in the early 2000s, right? So I'm dating myself a bit there. Went on doing that for a chunk of time. That was a really fun time to be hacking the internet. It feels a little bit like today, but back then, before the trustworthy computing memo and before like default firewalls on home PCs and just all sorts of crazy fun that you could get up to at that point. But I actually made a transition across into solutions sales and architecture in 2006, just off the back of really enjoying breaking into stuff, but actually really enjoying the business and kind of the marketing side of it as well. So it's one thing to solve a problem, but if you're not connecting that problem solution fit to where the problem exists, the problem remains unsolved. So I got kind of deep into the sales and marketing side of it. And one thing led to another and started Bugcrowd, really started working on it in 2011 and kind of kicked off in 2012. And kind of the idea behind that was looking at the problem that we have to solve as defenders, which is basically outsmarting this crowd of adversaries that has like lots of different skill sets, lots of different motivations, and kind of an incentive structure that looked very different to how we were doing it at the time. We were expecting to be able to compete with that, with someone being paid by the hour or with whatever automation we had available. And it's like the math is wrong. So that was just annoying me. But the other side of it, which really kind of was what spawned a lot of what Disclose.io works on, is having grown up as a hacker. And inside that community, it's like there's a lot of people like me that are disconnected from the problem because the world assumes that we're bad because of what we can do and because of what we're curious about. Like that's a stupid problem for the internet to have. Like, let's try to fix that. So it was those two ideas kind of floating around that kind of collided at some point. And yeah, I started off Bugcrowd, and here we are.
And there were that point in time was one in which there were a number of companies that founded with a similar approach. It kind of was like a shift, like you said. For many years there was this assumption that if you're finding vulnerabilities in software, you're a bad guy, right? Instead of, which was the sort of security and obscurity argument, right? Like, instead of, no, actually they're doing good work, they're finding flaws, right? And really important work, right? And should be compensated for it and incentivized, right?
They should be compensated for it. At the very least, they shouldn't be like operating under a chilling effect or at risk of prosecution, right? Like that was the big thing as a starting point. It's like, let's just make this not a crime in the same way, or at the very least acknowledge the fact that like hacking is a dual use skill. The bad guys use it too, and that's why people were so freaked out about it. But there's the good version, like there's the locksmith version versus the burglar version that we're disconnecting from the problem by keeping it like this. So yeah, it was interesting because we didn't invent bug bounty or vulnerable disclosure. That was all kind of prior art dating back to the early 90s. And before for vulnerable disclosure. But we did kick off this idea of basically putting a platform in between as much of the community as we can kind of gather up, and then as many different problems as we can find on the defender side. And today there's like 80 companies that do the same thing. So the idea is well and truly out of the bag at this point.
Dude, you guys need your own conference.
I mean, we're not going to claim DEF CON, but
you need an industry group.
When we started, and it's a lot bigger now. So, I think we played at least some role in that.
Yeah, of course. You need an industry lobbying group just for the bug bounty industry.
Yeah, I think that's not wrong for sure.
That's what you need.
Yeah.
So take us back to 2012, around the time you set up Bugcrowd, and looking at today, how has the market for bug bounties changed during that time? What have things that Bugcrowd has helped to realize? What do you see?
No, definitely. And I think I want to draw a distinction there, like the market for vulnerabilities, like in a bug bounty context, and just this general idea that humans write software, humans aren't perfect, therefore vulnerabilities are going to exist, and sometimes you'll need humans to find them, which I sort of class as almost like this top level kind of version of what we have to solve, because you're not going to pay for them unless you accept them in the first place, right? I feel like there's a ton of progress that's been made. One of the interesting parts of the Bugcrowd story is that we actually landed in the US the same month that Snowden did his thing, and I think a really interesting side effect of that whole kind of situation was it got it was one of the first times I think the world had all collectively thought about hacking as something that potentially affects them, at the same time, no matter whether they were lay people or industry folk or whatever else. It's oh, wow, okay, I thought that was that weird thing in the corner. But now all of a sudden it's potentially impacting them as individuals. And I feel like that was kind of a turning moment for the cybersecurity industry just in general, right? So we definitely took advantage of that. It was interesting from there because, as you said, there was a lot of, probably the first maybe 2 years of Bugcrowd, and then seeing, some other competitors kind of join and get pretty well funded as well at that point in time, was mostly about going out and convincing people that hackers aren't always evil. Because, there was a lot of are you insane? This is a crazy idea kind of response that we got at that point in time. And it was really when the Department of Defense did hack the Pentagon, that was to me another turning point, because folk are looking at them saying, hey, if you got all the bombs and guns and people, and you're this sort of apex predator and
classified
defender,
information, right?
Yeah, classified stuff, but you've got all this capability, and if you're still tapping a 15-year-old on the shoulder to come help you out with your computers, then maybe I should do that too, as a Fortune 1000 or whatever else, right? So that was I think sort of where it was. I think today we're in a position where it was getting better pretty rapidly for a big chunk of time there in terms of internet security and safety. I feel like COVID really kind of threw a bit of a wrench in the machine, because everyone had to do a bunch of stuff really quickly to pivot towards work from home and whatnot. And speed tends to be the enemy of good decision making when it comes to security.
Right.
And now, in 2025, we've got AI powered coding. We've got the restructuring of economics and labor, and how people want to operate their companies. There's all of this sort of flux and speed getting added again to the mix. So it's an interesting time. I think the role that researchers play now is working out. It's the same as it's always been. You figure out that cutting edge, right? But it's, how does all of these new tools and these kind of new environments that we're going into globally, how does that affect, internet security at a product level, but then at a system level as well?
Yeah. No, that's a really, really interesting point. And I mean, when you think about it too, it's not like we ever really got our feet beneath us after COVID. I mean, one of the things that COVID put a rocket booster on was the migration from on-premises to cloud infrastructure, right? Just because you suddenly had to support this, perimeterless environment with workers all over the world working from home. And then shortly thereafter, right, AI, ChatGPT 3 comes out, and AI starts, generative AI starts to really just also kind of do that type of curve. And that's kind of where we are now.
Yeah, well, and then
Yeah.
you've got a whole lot more people doing a lot more things with a lot more capability, and that's I don't think that that's inherently a bad thing on the builder and the defender side. But
Yep.
going back to what I said before, it's like speed, and to some degree even like capitalist competition is kind of the natural enemy of good choices when it comes to building stuff. So the faster things go logically, the more potentially fragile they're going to be, and we're certainly seeing evidence of that actually playing out at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. I sometimes use the example of just imagine cities like, Manhattan or Sydney or Boston with, no building codes, right? And no structural engineers,
Yeah.
but with an emphasis on like speed to construct and, architectural innovation, right? Like, what would you have, right? You'd have really interesting buildings that
you'd have things that fall over sometimes,
or small fires that just consume whole buildings, and right, because they're I mean, and that's kind of what we have in the software industry. I don't know.
It definitely, and I think that's a legacy. I mean, that's as much a legacy problem as much as it is a cutting edge one at this point. Because like what COVID did is it exposed a whole bunch of stuff to the internet that shouldn't have been exposed to the internet necessarily in that way, because of the priority towards remote access and different things like that. And you look at what the typhoons are doing and what some of the IABs are doing, all that kind of stuff at this point in time, like that's pretty clearly being like heavily exploited, and that stuff is hard to fix. Like it basically sits out there and powers the entire internet. So back to your building metaphor, like that's the foundation that we're on. Right. And in the meantime, we're building up as quickly as we possibly can at the same time. So it's a pretty, I mean, I think there are things that can be done to solve and address this. The list of kind of variables that are in the pot at this point in time makes me a little bit uncomfortable, because there's just a lot happening all at once.
So one of the really important things that Bugcrowd did was to kind of take the job of setting up sort of a platform for vulnerability researchers to interact with companies, rather than leaving it to the company to be like, well, you got to set up a portal and you've got to manage these relationships and you've got to create incentive programs. Like you kind of took that all off their back and said, we'll do all that for you, and we'll grow this community. We'll go out and find new people and pull them in. Do you and I know obviously over the years your customer base has grown greatly. Is there still more work to be done, I guess I would ask, as more and more companies become software companies, even companies that used to be just, manufacturers of stuff? Are you seeing more migration to this idea of like, we need to have a formal kind of security function. We need to have a front door for security researchers and be able to accept what they're giving us. Like, is that starting to become just a pillar of the community, or is it still a hard sell in some cases?
I think it varies depending on which part of the community you're in. Like, I think for companies that have started like more recently, like companies that are cloud native or AI native, in general, they'll have at least some kind of influence within the organization to say, hey, like, we're not going to be perfect at this. We need to be able to let folk from the outside know when we've introduced a risk. And they need to know that they're safe in doing that to us, like as a bare minimum, right? So I think that's pretty common as a default thing that you just do. Like, GitHub and your different kind of code repos have a push button get security.txt file piece, for example. And like Discloso has a policy generator that gets a ton of use. It's actually boilerplate language that protects, folk in both directions. So that's, I think, pretty common amongst tech and kind of more modern organizations. The older ones are still kind of catching on in a lot of ways.
Old economy companies that are
old economy. And I think there is this sort of leap of humility that you need to make before you'll actually accept that input from the outside.
Right.
Like you've got to go from like ostrich risk management, where it's like, if I just ignore this problem, it won't exist, to saying, hey, like, okay, to err as human, let's get better at not doing that, but let's also assume that we'll never be perfect at avoiding that, and figure out, how else we can get help. there's a posture shift inside an organization that needs to happen before they'll do that.
Hmm.
I think in general, older, larger organizations have a harder time with it, just across the board. So that's VDP and like vuln disclosure. I think bug bounty is definitely like this sort of odd, like to me, it's sort of like the odd stepchild of vuln disclosure in some ways, because like I believe that vulnerabilities are valuable. For an organization to actually offer to pay money for that and to have that information be directed to them instead of going somewhere else, like it's similar kind of thinking shift that we were just talking about with vuln disclosure in the first place. So, adoption there is growing like crazy. I think it is. It's also kind of driven, I think, in some ways by efficiencies of like the labor market, right? Like this, going back to the founding principle of Bugcrowd, it's like it takes a crowd. One of the reasons attackers are successful is because they're so diverse. So like this idea of having this diverse kind of intelligence capability to be able to basically compete with them, that makes a lot of sense, especially when you think about the right people being hard to hire, or it being competitive, or whatever else. So there's a lot of different things that are sort of driving that, but that'd be my summary, I guess.
And we've seen some evidence of just how hot this market is. Among them, I believe Apple just announced a $2 million bounty for an iOS O-Day.
Yeah,
or three. Was it
for
three?
a full chain? Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is wild.
This was for what? A no-click remote code.
Yeah, I believe it's like no-click full chain. So it's not just exploiting; it's like getting to ring zero or below on the iPhone. So yeah, I mean bugs.
And my guess is there are other darker organizations that would probably pay more for that.
A lot more.
Yeah.
So it's that. I mean, so if you're talking about the offensive procurement market versus the defensive one, like this is something that I've been adjacent to, and in some ways part of my entire career. And the reality is, like, it's shifted, I think, over the past probably again since COVID, since your like initial access brokers and you kind of like cyber criminal riffraff have entered the chat. Prior to that, you wouldn't really see offensive exploit procurement for anything that was hosted as a platform, because the logic was partly that like if we exploit that and it gets detected, it gets fixed in the one place, and then our ability to use that exploit goes away. That's to me shifted quite a bit over the last 5 years. Like you look at the IABs I've mentioned a couple of times, like initial access brokers. You look at the tactics of the typhoons, where it's just basically opportunistically spray like machine gun the entire internet and see what sticks. We've definitely drifted away from stealth on the attacker side, and I think what that does is it means that there is actual economic competition for those bugs at this point. It used to just be like Adobe, Oracle, Apple,
Microsoft,
Android, Microsoft, like 10 maybe vendors where there'd be that kind of competition around that package of information that'd drive it up to something like $3 million to buy it defensively, like Apple are doing. That's not as true for a lot of other organizations, but it's starting to become true across the board, I think.
So you just attended a first ever conference called Offensive AI. I think it was in San Diego.
Yep.
Super interesting. As its name suggests, this is around using artificial intelligence to find vulnerabilities and other problems with software that could be used by an offensive actor.
Yep.
You were one of the organizers of that, or advisors
I was
to
involved very early on. I'm an advisor to a company called Dreadnought, who are the originators of the conference. And given all of the conferencey stuff Bugcrowd's done over the years, I gave them a little bit of help in the early days, but it's definitely to the credit of the team for putting it on. It was phenomenal.
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, great idea for a conference. Yeah. Second of all, so what was your take? What do you see any interesting presentations, and what do you take away from that?
Yeah, there was a lot. I mean, I think the biggest take that I kind of came away with is that there's this sort of, the interesting thing about offensive AI and offensive applications of AI is that you've got like the machine learning and AI people approaching the whole thing from this like probabilistic math direction. And then you've got all of the like old school cyber operators basically saying POC or GTFO. So it's like you've either got shell or you don't, right? And just kind of watching them slowly get closer and closer together and figure out like how to help the other has been
interesting.
Really interesting over the past 3 years. This was a really good example of an effort to do that. But the thing that really did jump out was that like that is starting to work pretty well now, especially when you've got like deep tech AI folk working like hand in hand with offensive practitioners. They sort of understand the mission at this point, which is cool. Right. There's definitely a gap between the people that do that and don't. A lot of these kind of AI powered pen testing platforms that are popping up rely almost exclusively on the state of the art, like foundational models, and coupling those to tooling and prompting them and doing other kind of fairly, frankly, easy to do things when it comes to AI engineering. And as the state of the art models get better at offense and better understanding code, the differentiation across that market's going to get kind of woolly, I think. So there's a lot of talk about like reinforcement learning and, I can get super nerdy, but I won't there. Probably the other piece is like, so there's those two sides and then you've got,
it's okay.
There's those two sides, and then you've got like the policy and like the national security side of it as well, because there was a lot of folk with that bent in the room. Yeah, policy hasn't caught up with this stuff at all, aside from a lot of the the conversations coming out of DC and frankly other parts of the world as well, that we need to just collectively get better at offense in like a cyber warfare context. So it's less about pen testing and more about let's go disrupt the thing.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of the mutually assured destruction model in some ways, right?
Definitely. There's a lot of calls for deterrence out of DC, which is, I don't disagree with it, but the thing that's awkward about that is that like, if you talk about mutually assured destruction in like a nuclear context, like the outcome of a bomb going off is basically the same no matter where it happens in the world, right? Whereas with cyber, it's going to depend on your infrastructure. It's going to depend on how well you defend yourself, how well you can like, eject attackers, all those different things. So it's just that's a bit of a weird one. But it did come back to, on the NatSec side, some of what we were just talking about, where it's like, there's all this conversation around cutting edge code and all of the new stuff that's going out. But in the meantime, we've got, telcos getting popped through like 15-year-old CentOS in like an edge device every week. Do you know what I mean? So it's sort of like, let's not forget, the kind of the root cause problems that we've got. Because if you apply AI to attacking that stuff, you can do a lot of damage very quickly. And that's now in the hands of a lot of people. So
Well, and we've just seen Microsoft end support for Windows 10, which is on, by one count, more than 1 billion devices globally. And that doesn't even count all the, Windows 8 and when you start looking into what versions of Windows are still out there and operating. That legacy code problem is just the elephant in the living room in some ways for organizations, especially more established organizations.
Exactly. And those below the security poverty line as well. I think.
That's right.
And that was a thing that really jumped out at me, because a lot of the folk that didn't grok that concept aren't necessarily those who've been around as long, right? So this idea that like you can't just go and update the Windows XP box that's driving your medical device, because the middleware that powers the company, like the company that makes that, went bankrupt in 2003, which is why you're stuck on Windows XP. Like you can't just forklift the entire thing. It's not a simple software solution in the way that I think a lot of people tend to think it is if they've not been around to see that type of thing. So that was a really interesting takeaway from it, just sort of seeing how real that is.
Right. And part of the problem, right, and we see this in other areas of our economy too, is that, like you said, there's a security poverty line, and you've got a lot of businesses that, are just trying to make ends meet. So they don't necessarily have the resources to invest in a 6 or 7 digit software upgrade, right?
Yeah.
Just like Towns
Yeah.
can't upgrade their sewer lines from, the lead pipes that were installed in, 1908 to, whatever,
Yeah, it's not a
PVC pipes now.
snap
Right.
the fingers kind of thing in the way that I think
Right.
a lot of folks that have come in more recently kind of think it might be.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so yeah, that was a really interesting takeaway, seeing that offensive AI is like the stuff you can do with it, especially right out at the cutting edge, is pretty crazy. Like when you're
Give me an
talking about
example.
like automated exploit generation, for example. So taking a big pile of code,
Yeah.
going through identifying vulnerabilities, but not stopping there, actually basically attaching capability to that vulnerability and then creating a payload that's usable at that point in time, like automating that entire pipeline. Like that's a thing. It's not, I think when people hear stuff like that, they're like, oh, I bet it doesn't work on iOS. And you're right, it doesn't. But if you're talking about simpler, like single or kind of 2 or 3 shot bugs, and you've got a wide enough set of things to potentially target with capability like that, then you can end up with a capability set that's actually pretty useful. So this idea of just being able to scale attacking, especially the bottom of the pyramid,
Yeah.
which is kind of where we've got some serious problems, right? Like that's actually getting really, really good at this point.
I mean, I've read articles that sort of suggest, will AI ever be as good as people, as individual security researchers in, finding bugs, hacking applications, that the sort of the intuition and the kind of go with your gut nature that the best, security folks have is going to be very hard to replicate in large language model AI, which is more algorithmic in nature, right? I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I mean, what do you think?
I have many, and I try not to be like horribly biased on this, because obviously, the thesis behind Bugcrowd and a lot of the work I've done over the years is that, cybersecurity it's not a technical problem. It's a human one, which means it's creative. So this idea of, theoretically, if automation and AI was to solve or exploit every single problem that we've got available to us right now, if I'm a criminal, I'm not at that point just packing up and going home, right? Like, because that predates the internet by a couple of thousand years, and I don't think it's just going to go away overnight. So there's that just as a starting point. Very practically, like the thing that AI struggles with is like, it's twofold. It's basically specialization and context. So the idea of it being specifically, our elder trained with trajectories into understanding particular vuln classes and all of the different permutations and how to think that through, and then how to coordinate with other agents that are trained on other things. Like, you've got to very deliberately build that for it to work. And most people kind of aren't. That's not what the state of the art models do. So I think there's a lot of folk kind of expecting a fish to climb a tree when they're saying, hey, can Claude, hack the Gibson, or whatever it might be. But that stuff will improve and get sort of deeper into the possibility of outcomes it can produce over time as the models get better, as they get trained with more data, like all that kind of stuff. So there's that. And on the context side, I think the bit where I really see AI struggling to fully replace human creativity when it comes to like vulnerability discovery, but then exploit development as well, is that it's not a linear path in the way that a lot of people think it is. It's not like, oh, that's a candidate for IDOR, I'm going to go pop IDOR and I'm done. If you're talking about a complex target or a network, or even like a hardware device that's been hardened, for example, what you're doing is you're accessing this like graph of different things that about anti-patterns and potentially exploitable conditions that exist within that target space. And what you're trying to do is to create pathways through that graph. And then permutations and combinations of how those different things interact with each other to get to the outcome that you want, right?
Right.
That's like
very fuzzy.
Yeah, well, the way that we're dealing with memory in AI
Yeah.
at the moment, in
Yeah.
particular, is just not meant for that.
Right. Right.
So like there'll be innovation around that in time, I'm sure. But in terms of AI as it exists today, yeah, it is definitely making life harder for folks that don't want to apply themselves to actually like taking advantage of this technology and leveling themselves up. And like we've seen that before, right? You think about when HD Moore dropped Metasploit. Like prior to that, everyone was writing shell code by hands, and all of a sudden the uniqueness of being able to do that sort of went away because you had a framework to do it for you, and you've got this like new set of people that come into the mix. Same thing happened with attack surface discovery, when it's like, how do I find things that are left on the internet? Like, to me, this is just in some ways another version of that at that level. So yeah, there's my convoluted answer.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we've seen over the decades, right? Like new technologies come along or new capabilities come along, and it just changes the path of the work that people do and the way this, who comes into the industry, and so one of the presentations, I think, at Offensive AI was Caleb Gross did this presentation on a free OSS tool to do static analysis. On like open source code. One of the ideas is, could we go out and find and remove all the vulns and flaws in open source code, which, as we know, because we're seeing so many, supply chain attacks and so many just, attacks on vulnerabilities in open source, would be highly valuable. Do you see that as possible application?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this was like, we got pretty involved in the DARPA, the AICC Cyber Grand Challenge, and that was actually one of the goals. There was the idea of like, don't just find vulnerabilities, but actually, patch them and fix them, and do that in a way that doesn't break the rest of the code. So, I do see that going there. Like, I'm involved with a company called Corridor that's doing basically AI assisted linting and kind of detection of this type of stuff in the IDE, so it kind of prevents it from being introduced into the code base in the first place. There's a variety of different solutions that people are trying to apply to that problem. For open source, I mean, to me, the challenge, the thing that needs to be overcome as a challenge there is that like finding bugs and even proposing a fix is not the hard part. The hard part is on the shoulders of the maintainer, trying to figure out like, how do I test this code? How do I make sure that it doesn't, cause a regression issue in some other part of the functionality of my library or whatever it might be? And if all of a sudden they're getting like jackhammered with this stuff from everyone with this type of tool across the internet, then you're going to end up with a triage issue on their end, right? So I think I do see it being a part of the solution, but I don't think, everyone's thinking about their own kind of particular little slice of the chain. And I don't feel like we've sort of linked that all up yet.
So what if you had to sort of say now, how you thought, AI is going to influence the future of, vulnerability research, vulnerability management, bug bounties? I mean, you're probably already seeing it starting to play out already, but what are your thoughts? And, if you were to look down the road 2 or 3 years and say, this is what this, this market's going to look like, what do you think?
Yeah. So, I trotted out, actually, we'll come back to that. Look, I think what it's doing is it's kind of reducing the, you must be this tall to ride height for attackers, full stop. And like, this is bug bounty hunters, it's vuln researchers, it's bad guys, it's like,
or even you need to be a human being to ride.
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately you still need to have a human press play on that type of thing at this point. So like, for as long as that's true, I'm not super concerned about that one. But yeah, it's that one is definitely a little scary. But yeah, it's basically, it's gotten people to a place where they can get to impact, they can get to like vuln discovery or even exploitation without having to have gone through, the 10 years of just being immersed in compute or the CS degree or the courses or whatever it is that they've done to kind of get to that place. And in some ways, I think it's a good thing. I do think there's like an atrophy that we're at risk of just by kind of being able to press easy mode and get over that hump. That's it. We'll see how that kind of all plays out. But I think in terms of how it's going to affect bug bounty and vuln disclosure just in general over the next period of time is that we're going to end up with a pretty major triage issue. Because like we just kind of what I was saying with open source, because the reality is, and like ask me how I know this, right? Like the reality is that everything is way more vulnerable than anyone really wants to admit. And just the sheer volume of vulnerabilities that you can discover is like far higher than I think most people would sort of realize, even on the engineering side. So if everyone's now able to discover them and send it through, then all of a sudden you've got to drink from that fire hose, right?
And of course, here in North America, in the US, like the CVE system broke even when it was basically humans discovering the CVEs and reporting them, not AI.
We played. I've apologized to Steve and Art and some of the other guys in there 100 times over, because we definitely played a role in that. Like there was definitely
no apology necessary.
It was sorry for the hard work, but like it needed to happen in some ways, because there was a linearity to what they were expecting to process before the bug bounty and vuln disclosure movement hit. And then all these people join, and then the volume increases, and it created a sublinear scaling need, which they struggle with. So this is just another version of that, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and this kind of leads to our next question. I mean, I see one of the problems is just a lack of public investment in supporting, the ecosystem, right? So when everybody started buying cars, we kind of, as a society, decided like, we need some better roads, and we better start building those roads for all these cars, But when everyone started running software and finding vulnerabilities in that software and so on, it was sort of like, no, we got the same team, at NIST or MITRE, we don't need to grow it. We need to put more money into that. Just kind of keep, what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it broke, right? I mean, it broke.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, like the highway example that you just gave, that was, ultimately kind of the Federal Highways Act that led to the 10th Amendment at that point in time. So like there are examples historically of there being acts of Congress or acts of federal government that enable that type of thing. I don't feel like we're in a great place to do that right now when it comes to stuff that's sort of proactive, when it comes to defending the country around stuff like this. I do think that there's a bunch of different things that are kind of feeding up into that. When you think about conflict and like the amount of money that's been diverted towards defense over the past period of time, like this does sort of play into that, seeing how that plays out. I ultimately think we've got to find a way to, make security like more attractive for the consumer than insecurity. So the idea of like, okay, I'm going to buy this product because I believe that it's safer for me and my data and all those different things than this other product, and try to create some positive incentives around this, because I don't feel like we've done a great job at that. I mean, when you look at like Facebook, Google, some of the like larger social media companies, Microsoft did this as well. Like they kind of pivoted towards putting privacy and security first, at least in their story. At a pretty important time to do that. And I think they
trustworthy computing memo, right?
Yeah, TWC in 2003, you talk about like all of the Facebook stuff and even the Google bug bounty program. Like they position that to the front to help the consumer feel confident in the safety of their data, and it worked for them. So it's like, what's the 2025 version of that? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the big concerns in the past few months has been funding for some of these key federal cybersecurity agencies, CISA, National Vulnerability Database, and MITRE, and so on. There was a big kind of, we're going to shut down the NVD. We've seen some of those crises averted, others not. What are your thoughts on where things stand and what we might want to do to shore up some of those systems and programs, or even better, kind of grow them and evolve them, right?
No,
Take
definitely.
this as an opportunity to change.
I mean, I think like NVD in particular is a ripe candidate for the actual, constructive use of AI. If you talk about like data decoration and all those different things, like it's a pretty good use case for that. So there's I think solution approaches that need to be thought through at whatever level. CVE is a really interesting one because at this point in time, I think it used to be like the global premier like list for this stuff, and I feel like it kind of lost that spot a little bit with all of the funding stuff, and now you've got like EUVD and all that kind of stuff kind of popping up around the world, and the ones that are already doing it are starting to double down as well. So that creates coordination issues and kind of keying issues, but at the end of the day, I think we're probably going to land in that place regardless of whether we like it or not. So I actually think that in North America, I don't know, there's the CVE Foundation that's popped up. There's a bunch of different people working on this problem, and I don't want to tread on any of their toes. But like, I do think that there's going to be just different variations of solution to this problem that'll pop up around the place, and the winner will be the one that does it best over time. Which is not the ideal way to get there, because you're trying to keep it stable in the process. But I think that's probably what's going to end up happening.
One of the things that happened recently was Bugcrowd announced a partnership with the state of Maryland around their own statewide vulnerability disclosure program. So for all state agencies, basically, can now have a way to disclose vulnerabilities in software that they're using. Is that are you seeing more interest at the state level in stuff like this? And it was part of a larger kind of reframing for Maryland of their kind of statewide cybersecurity policies. Really interesting. What are we? Is that something we're seeing more of, or you're seeing more of?
Definitely. I think there's two things there. Like, states are recognizing that they need and want the help, because when you think about like state infrastructure is the same as federal infrastructure, but like generally not as well funded. So you just end up with stuff everywhere. And it's not necessarily their fault. It's the product of it basically growing and building over time, right? So like the whole idea of there being value in as many folk as you can possibly get, helping you with like surfacing risk. There's a lot of interest in that side of it. I think as well, there's a lot of folk at the state level, like the legislative work that we've done over the years to try to, get like hack the XYZ things through Congress and the Senate, like trying to get the CFAA reformed through DOJ, and just those different things. Like
Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the one that puts hackers in jail if they do the wrong thing, or if they look like they're doing the wrong thing, which at the time meant just hacking. So we wanted to get that changed. It's like, if you're hacking and then you commit a crime, then you should be prosecuted for that. But unless you do the second part, then you're just hacking. It's fine.
Right.
The
fair use exemption, you might call it. Right.
There you go.
Yeah.
The work that's been done on those at the federal level has definitely slowed down over the past bit, just because there's so much going on in DC right now. So back to your question, like, there is a lot of opportunity, I think, for folk to go to their local representatives at the state level and basically educate them. Do what we've been doing with Hackers on the Hill with Congress and the Senate, but do it at the state level, and like help policymakers understand the things that are important to you as a technologist or as a hacker or as a cybersecurity person, if depending on who you are listening to this, because they're willing to listen to it and they'll act. I do think if there's enough inertia behind that, then that starts to reflect up and put pressure back on the federal side of things to make changes at that level as well. So
got time for one more question?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
So
we're going to get into that one some more, but it's good. Like, there's definitely sorry, let me just one last piece.
Go ahead.
Sort of on the call to arms side of things, like not literally call to arms, but like call to action for folks that are passionate about this stuff. the other side of it is just seeing, vulnerability disclosure adoption by as many organizations as possible, just to normalize it at that level. And then, trying to get the narratives out there where we're actually celebrating the fact that like they've basically created this humble posture where they're receiving information from the outside, which means they're probably more mature from a security standpoint.
Right.
But also they're creating a safer environment for hackers. Like I think getting even the public to some degree, like at least interested in that story, I think that's the other opportunity to create that kind of bottom up pressure on your federal stuff.
Yeah, that is the kind of, in some ways, the irony of vulnerability disclosure programs is, you would look at a company like, Microsoft or Google and be like, wow, I mean, they've got tens of thousands of vulnerabilities reported for their software. And this company, they don't have any, so they must be much safer than Microsoft. And it's like, no, it's actually the exact opposite because right, because they're actually working on the security problem. This other organization is basically just ignoring it, right? But unless you're steeped in this industry, you might not get that, right?
Might not necessarily recognize that, 100%.
Yeah. So I mean, some kind of law that would level that field and be like, no, you got a vulnerability, you got to disclose it, you got to be transparent about it, and that way we know, more or less, looking across all these firms which are doing a better or worse job. Because we know we're looking at it's apples to apples, right? But participation in vulnerability disclosure is completely arbitrary, completely discretionary at this point. Yeah,
that's correct. So
and if you don't have a security culture in your company, then you're probably not you're gonna be like, why would we do that? We don't want to put
it's going to create more of a lift. And this is where it does come back to this idea of like making it not just as easy as possible, but like attractive for the organization.
Right.
This is a part of what we've tried to do with Disclosure. It's like you can tap Bugcrowd or any of the other platforms on the shoulder to help you actually run the program. But this, at the very least, will get you started off with a policy and the core things that you need to be able to have a legal framework for that interaction. Right. And that's open source. That's free, as it should be from my perspective. Right. Yep.
Okay. Final question is a generational question, which is one of the problems that we're seeing is an aging of the open source maintainer population, right? So lack of interest in younger folks to get involved in open source projects. Back in July, Bugcrowd hosted Bug Bash, which was a live hacking event focused on K-12 and EdTech software. Really interesting. And I guess you had college students who found something like 30 previously unknown vulnerabilities as part of that.
Yeah.
What's your thought on the generational issue and how we get young folks to come into this industry and get involved? Because we need their energy and their smarts and their years.
Especially the last part. Like I actually gave the closing keynote at B-Sides Las Vegas this year on exactly this subject. Because it's just I've had some sort of fresh reminders of the fact that like it's important, but also like the older generation is not permanent, and these guys are the ones that are going to actually inherit the problem.
Yes.
So
you are not old, by the way, Casey. But go ahead. Anyway, yes. Let's be clear here.
Just older.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think getting them involved, getting them. The thing about Gen Z, as far as I can tell, because I don't want to get okay boomered on this one, but they are definitely there is a mission drive to it, and there's a community sense of a mission drive within that generation. I do feel like cybersecurity as an industry has lost that a little bit as we've commercialized so rapidly over the past decade. So finding ways to bring some of that stuff back in. One thing that's been really interesting is getting involved with a group called the Hacking Games, who are basically trying to do this, like create a Gen Z like talent pipeline. But the bulk of their angle is like, this is to make sure that your peers don't get recruited into cybercrime, because that's the thing that's happening, right? So it's less about the bugs and like, let's protect the corporations or any of that stuff. It's more like, we just don't want you guys to go to jail. And if that's something that, pulls on your heartstrings and makes you think about your peers, then you can get involved in actually diverting them into something that's productive as as a career in an industry. So I think that seems to be working fairly well. But yeah, it's key that we start I think proactively talking to each other across generations, because the other side of it with this younger group is that they're native to an internet that I'll never be native to. And the same's true in reverse, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
I know things from my experience that they'll never fully understand natively or might take time to learn. And then they can see an internet that I just will never be able to see in the same way. So it's like, all right, there's value in getting those things to talk.
Right. And you might think like, well, you go to DEF CON and it's such a scene. There are so many people there. And yeah, there are a lot of young people there, a lot of older people there too. But like, you also have to realize like this, DEF CON and Black Hat have their roots back in the 90s when in-person events were how you do things. Young kids these days, so much of their life is about what they're experiencing online and who's contacting them online. And so you got to fish where the fish are, right? You got to go out and meet people where they are on Discord or whatever.
Yeah. And actually
use those platforms. Yeah.
I think that's a huge thing. The DEF CON Black Hat thing has been the subject of much discussion by both conferences over the past couple of years, because it's like we're sort of aging out and we're not really finding ways to replace or create the same environment that we want for the younger generations. And whenever I'm in a room where that question comes up, I'm like, who here in this room is from that generation, and can you give us the answer to that question? And no one ever puts their hand up. Right? So I'm like, there's a clue, right? Like the idea of looking at the different places that these generations are kind of getting together, but then as well, not necessarily trying to take ownership of it as the older generation. It's like, how do you identify the people that are the future leaders of that group? Because they're the ones who are going to get it. And they'll explain it to us over time, but they're like, we're going to take a long time to actually understand natively how to make this work compared to them. So to me, that just makes sense.
Yeah. All right, man. Casey Ellis,
like we solved it.
always really interesting conversation. And thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. We'll definitely have you on again. And,
I look forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for all the hard work you do. Thank you for all the advocacy you do.
Appreciate it, man.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much, Paul. Cheers.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us. All right.